What's going on, everyone? Preston Stewart and Sayer Payne with War Stories, joined today by Steve Coll. Sir, thank you so much for taking the time.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you've done a lot and written a lot, but I was hoping we could focus today on some of your work in Afghanistan, both pre 9/11, a little bit during, and then maybe even some, I guess not after the U.S. has left. But anyways, you've got a sizable volume on Afghanistan at this point.
Yeah, I was sent out there by accident as a Washington Post correspondent. I mean, in the sense that it wasn't an assignment that I expected or sought. I was a young reporter at the paper, and the way the foreign desk worked, you just went where they sent you if you wanted to be an international correspondent. And they sent me to Delhi, and I arrived just as the last Soviet troops, having invaded the country in 1979, were withdrawing in the winter of 1989, early 1989. So just after they left, I turned up, and the war was a mess. The Soviets had left behind a civil war that was percolating, and so it was a very, it was still a big story in Washington for reasons we can talk about because of the CIA's involvement in the anti-Soviet rebellion. But I think right away, maybe a generation of journalists who went out in the heady days of defeating the Soviet Union might have gotten caught up in some of the euphoria of the success of the Afghan rebellion. But my generation that came when the Civil War started to occur just saw its complexity and how messy it was, I think, right away.
What region of the country did you arrive? Like, where were you at in the country at that time?
So there were two ways that you could cover the war in that period. The Soviets had left behind a strong man in Kabul, Najibullah, who controlled an archipelago of cities, not much different on the map than what NATO ended up controlling after the Taliban insurgency gathered heat. Say circa 2011, you could hop around from Kabul to Mazar to Herat to Jalalabad to Kandahar, but the roads were unsafe even in daytime, and at night the guerrillas controlled the countryside. So there were basically two sides of the war, and the way you would cover it would be to get the government side to go see President Najibullah himself. He was accessible. You would fly from Delhi, which was a Soviet ally and therefore an ally of the government in Kabul, into Kabul. And then you'd stay in the capital, which had a kind of ringed defense, again, very similar to the NATO defense of Kabul later. And guerrillas just outside, in Logar and Wardak, places like that. And you could stay in the city. And then you'd have to jump onto Afghan Air Force flights, often because it was a communist government, essentially, or a neo-communist government, as the Soviet Union started to crack up. It was all set pieces, like escorted tours, but you could fly around the country. And I saw quite a lot of the country that was controlled by the government. And then the other way you could go in would be over the border with the guerrillas from Pakistan. In that case, you had to go to either Peshawar or Quetta, on the Pakistani cities on the Afghan frontier, and pick up either a guerrilla commander or some kind of rebel NGO that had, passes to travel in guerrilla-controlled territory, and then you could go in and wander around and see the war from the guerrilla side. Now, a lot of journalists had been doing that during the anti-Soviet period. By the time I got there, that was still doable, and I did it, but things were a little bit nastier than they had been because Arab volunteers had turned up, people who we came to know as Al-Qaeda, though they weren't known as Al-Qaeda at that time. And they, unlike the Afghans, who you could pretty well trust, if they said they would take you, they would keep you safe as best they could. They weren't going to kidnap you or put you on trial for being and but the only people who were dangerous were the Arabs. If you ran into Afghan Arabs on the road, they started to execute aid workers. They'd pull people out of cars and shoot them and stuff like that. So it got a little bit trickier to figure out who you were going to travel with and what kind of juice they had to, to kind of get you where you were going in one piece.
How did you navigate that as a journalist? That sounds like a very CIA heavy, which tribe, which leader is legitimate. How are you doing that?
Well, I mean, this was my daily reporting subject, like who's who, what's going on, who's favored by who. And I didn't try to make those judgments about travel right away, but within a few months I had and there's a lot of other journalists and a lot of aid workers and a lot of diplomats and that you can talk to. Islamabad and Peshawar was like a Star Wars bar kind of depot. Everybody was there and all kinds of information was traded at Green's Hotel or at various watering. The American Club was one place. The French Club was a very sought after place for lunch. And anyway, there was a lot of information. Like information traded in the Star Wars bars. It was of questionable reliability sometimes,
Sure.
but you could triangulate it and then start to meet people, use your own intuition, and double check and so on. I did, this was my first time covering conflict. During that time, I covered other conflicts in Kashmir and Sri Lanka, but in the Middle East, but the Afghan war was the first time that I had really traveled with guerrillas and had to make judgments about who to go with and whether this was like a sensible thing to do. And I took solace from, a lot of other people who had done it before, tell you what to look out for and who can be trusted. And, but I did find, I think many outsiders to Afghanistan discover this in their own way, and not to romanticize or to suggest that there aren't lots of bad people who aren't trustworthy in every country. But, I came to respect the honorable commitments that Afghans, even in very difficult circumstances, would make to me. And that it was, once they made that commitment, I felt, okay, yeah, we're honor bound together. We're going to go through this together. I'm going to do my part and they're going to do their part. And I could watch it happen. They were not going to leave me behind or kind of expose me to unnecessary risks. I mean, we were all walking into a conflict. So, you can be in the wrong place at the wrong time, but they didn't treat you as a burden. They treated you as a guest. And once I got comfortable with how to evaluate who I was with, I really, it deepened my experience of the war just to travel with these people in different times, sometimes when they were under very heavy pressure or fire, and they'd still feel like, yeah, we got you, don't worry.
Could you sort of elaborate on that, under fire? Like, who are these belligerents right now? Because it is complicated. But now at least we can narrow it down to post sort of Soviet time frame. But you mentioned Najibullah being a communist. So now I'm assuming he's sort of a part of that puppet regime that was propped up during the Soviet era. But now you're talking guerrilla groups. So it's like, are we talking regional? Are we talking tribal, ethnic, as in Pashtun groups and Tajik groups? And can you explain what that setting was like?
Yeah, all those things. I mean, the two biggest factions of the rebellion when the Soviets left, the most powerful contenders for the victory that the Civil War, became about, were Ahmad Shah Massoud, legendary guerrilla commander based in the Panjshir, although he'd grown up in Kabul, which is a valley in the north of Afghanistan, ethnic Tajik. And although, an Islamist in a kind of personal and even ideological sense, was moderate, tolerant, a political guerrilla commander, very self-conscious about being more than a war fighter, trying to build a movement, so on. And then his rival was a fellow who's still alive and against all odds, like still alive and still influential in Afghanistan, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who represented a group called Hizb Islami, which was essentially a proxy for the Pakistan Army and Intelligence Service. He was their favorite son. He was an ethnic Pashtun, but he was also just pliant or whatever had made his bed with the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence service. And he had received quite a lot of cash and weapons from the Pakistanis. And he operated, if Massoud was kind of authentically based in the north, Hekmatyar, who also had grown up in Kabul and kind of was a political activist at Kabul University, he operated on that kind of beeline that the Haqqanis, have often operated on between Peshawar and Kabul, like the shortest distance between Pakistan and the capital of Afghanistan. That was his kind of area. So, and he had a national movement. He had commanders in other Pashtun areas and even in the north, and he and Massoud's people, were getting into scraps all the time. But you ask who were the combatants that we experienced as journalists. I mean, I would never travel with Hekmatyar's people, but on the other hand, if you ran into them, they might hassle you as an American, but they weren't going to execute you or something like that. Massoud's people were much more professional and friendly about escorting journalists and NGOs. They had this, operation that was just easier to deal with. But there were also smaller, moderate parties that weren't much in the war, but had access to particular parts of the country. You could travel with them. But the big turning point, if we skip forward a little bit after the Soviet withdrawal, was initially when the Soviets left, the CIA predicted this war is going to be over in 6 weeks. And everybody expected the rebels to walk right into Kabul. And, there's a lot of bickering about who would be prime minister, but it was taken for granted that they would soon be running Afghanistan. Well, Najibullah's government and the forces aligned with it didn't want to surrender to these mujahideen, especially Hekmatyar, whose ideas about women in the workplace and cultural space and even ethnic Tajiks and Hazaras didn't sound friendly to them. And Najibullah did a great job of ginning up propaganda, which actually turned out to be rooted in fact about how bad it would be if Hekmatyar came in. And so the war, so the rebels failed. All the predictions were wrong. It didn't take 6 weeks, it took 3 years. And the only reason in the end they walked into Kabul when they did was because the Soviet Union collapsed. It ended. And when it collapsed, its air bridge and its supplies to the Kabul government, the former communist, now nationalist communist government, ended. And when the Soviet Union pulled out, I mean, it's very similar to last August when NATO pulled the plug, the United States pulled the plug in Afghanistan, psychologically and materially. As soon as the Soviet Union basically said, we're done, in their case, because their country didn't exist anymore, and it just wasn't a priority of the follow-on Russian government, which was itself in chaos. That was it. The government collapsed. And I was in Kabul on the Sunday when the guerrillas walked in. And Ahmad Shah Massoud and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar had been planning for this day for 3 years, a lot longer than they'd hoped to plan for it. But they knew what they wanted. They wanted to take territory, and they immediately went to war. There was about 12 hours of like people firing guns in celebration in the air, and citizens very wary of these guys coming in from the countryside, putting flowers in their tank barrels and so on. And then that lasted, hours. And by the next morning, Hekmatyar's guys had grabbed the Interior Ministry. Massoud's people had grabbed the presidential palace. A guy named, who you probably remember, Abdul Rashad Dostum, an Uzbek commander who was kind of an independent force. He grabbed the airport, and they just, they started blasting each other to try to control the capital. And it was kind of a dangerous couple of weeks. The airport closed. Then it was hard to find an escort. Journalists were just driving around in cars, trying to look down the street before you turned down it. And but I do remember so vividly just talking about that sense of Afghan kind of honor or hospitality, even under extreme pressure. I went down one morning to the presidential palace where there was a really hot fight going on, buildings burning, crossfire. between Massoud and Hekmatyar's people for control of the presidential palace. And Massoud's people looked like they were winning. And anyway, they were the friendly party. So I went over, somehow circled around behind them, got in, found my way, was taken to a commander. And he said, "What do you want? What are you doing here?" I said, "I just want to watch. I want to know what's going on. I don't have a camera. I don't need to take pictures. I just, I'm happy to sit behind the building, but can I stay here?" And he said, "Yeah, okay, you're with me." And I stayed with him the whole afternoon, watching him command this kind of tactical fight to take over the rest of the grounds and to throw Hekmatyar's people out, which he had managed to do by sunset. And it was like a very vivid experience, but also gave me a really good understanding of how the battle for the future of Afghanistan was unfolding. And in fact, they threw Hekmatyar out of the city within 2 weeks. And he went down to Charsiab, I think it's in Logar. It's probably about 30, 40 clicks south of Kabul's southern rim. And he just set up shop there, and using rockets that had been supplied by American taxpayers, he started bombarding the city for the next few years. And the civil war didn't end, but the control of the capital was established pretty quickly.
So in the period before this, when the Soviets are in Afghanistan, the US, CIA specifically, has a very set interest in bleeding the Soviets, I guess I'll say. And then once the Taliban take power and the US is moving into Afghanistan in 2001, there's also a very clear goal that the US has in mind. But that middle period that you're talking about right now, was the US and CIA just waiting to see how it played out? Were they deliberately taking sides? What did that look like?
It's a great question. It kind of happened gradually and not with purpose. So when the Soviets left in 1989, there was this, as you say, robust CIA covert action program to arm and fund the rebels, carried out in concert with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. And lots of money, $1 billion a year in 1989 dollars. So real money was going into these rebel parties. When the Soviets withdrew, because they left behind an allied government, Najibullah's government, the covert action program did not end, but it shrank, and it sort of petered out between 1989 and the end of 1991, when, by agreement with the still barely existing Soviet Union, both sides decided to terminate their aid to their proxies in the war. Now, what then should the United States do? It didn't need a covert action program because Kabul fell soon after that. But Afghanistan was still racked by civil war. The civil war got worse and worse as each year passed. Its drug production and the impact of Afghan heroin on the world increased dramatically. Al-Qaeda and like-minded jihadi groups surfaced outside of Afghanistan, menacing the government of Egypt. There was the first World Trade Center bombing in February 1993, and those were Afghan jihad veterans. So there were people in the US government who argued, even though it seemed like far away and impossible, kind of a Somalia problem, it's never going to get fixed. People, diplomats and others who argued, we can't afford to walk away from this because of the global nature of the terrorism and drugs and organized crime that is starting to flower here. We got to help stabilize Afghanistan. But those arguments never got traction. And you had the Bush administration. I mean, in fairness, between 1989 and 1992, let's all remember, the world turned upside down. Soviet Union collapsed, Cold War ended, Berlin Wall fell, Germany reunified, Tiananmen Square happened in China, democracy movements broke out all over Central and Eastern Europe.
What is Afghanistan? Yeah.
What is Afghanistan? I mean, you couldn't, literally, when I was doing the research for the book that became Ghost Wars, I was just trying as a, kind of journalist historian to figure out exactly when the president decided that he didn't want to have anything to do with Afghanistan anymore. And was it George H.W. toward the end of his administration in '92, or was it Clinton? Who brought the options paper to the to the Oval Office and the president took it to the residence and he looked over the options and said, it's just not worth it. Like, well, so what I found out was there was no options paper. It never got that far. Like they just never, they couldn't even get on the agenda. There were like deputies level meetings and people would say, let's develop some options about humanitarian aid or counterterrorism or anti-drug. And, they could get some attention for low level, sort of allocation of existing funding kind of thing, but there was no policy. There was just no policy. And it was because in Bush's time, oh, by the way, he also expelled Saddam Hussein from Kuwait during this period.
Yeah, I was thinking the same. Desert Storm had a
countries,
lot to handle.
He was, I mean, in fairness, he was busy. He was busy, and
yeah,
and he and Brent Scowcroft, as National Security Advisor, I mean, they I think even all these years later, you look back, they did a pretty good job managing like one of the craziest pivot points in post-war history. And they did it partly by trying to decide what mattered most. And so this, in the end, they didn't pay any attention to. Then Clinton came in, and by the time he came in, Afghanistan was really isolated, descending into terrible poverty and violence. The UN no longer even, could organize peace negotiations or get the parties together. Everybody was exhausted, and anyway, Clinton wasn't a foreign policy president. He was hardly going to make Afghanistan a priority.
What were the party's motivation to sort of overthrow Najibullah? Like, I understand that he was a Soviet puppet, let's say. Were they all these different guerrilla groups, whether they're Pashtun or Tajik, they're all Afghan? Are they trying to, because it just sounds to me, these guerrilla groups, their first priority, their main priority was overthrowing Najibullah, not necessarily having a plan afterwards, but like, why did they have the beef with Najibullah? Is it because of communist, atheist, where Islam is tied in? Is it just he's a puppet of a different country and we're Afghans and we want Afghan led? Like, what were the motivations for the violence to begin with?
Well, I mean, essentially, it was anti-communist, Islamist and nationalist revolt, a very broad nationalist revolt against the communist government that was imposed on Afghanistan by the Soviet invasion. I mean, it actually had taken power a couple of years before the Soviet invasion through a coup. And then the Afghan Communist Party, which had been kind of cultivated by the KGB, the Soviet KGB intelligence service during the 70s, when they took power, they kind of read these Soviet communist textbooks about how you stage a communist revolution, and they went wild with ripping up every tradition in Afghanistan, basically imposing atheism as the official state doctrine on a country that is profoundly conservative and religious. I mean, and in a diverse set of Islamic faith traditions, including, Sufi and other kinds of moderate traditions that weren't political at all. They were just thousands of years old and part of the fabric of Afghan life. And suddenly this weird group of college professors takes power in Kabul and basically tears up all of the national traditions. And so the revolt that started in 1979, 78, 79, I mean, it was really broad-based. It was every sector of Afghan society. Now, like a lot of rebellions, it ended up getting captured by these ideologists who had the favor of Pakistan's ISI primarily, so Hekmatyar and so forth. And Pakistan and Hekmatyar, they had a more specific ideology. They were Muslim Brotherhood influenced, transnational political Islamists who wanted to impose, after communism, a more explicitly Islamist government in the kind of mold of a Muslim Brotherhood style government. That's who Hekmatyar was. That was his training, in university and in seminary and graduate school and so forth. But Masood, Hekmatyar's rival, though he had studied many of the same texts and was part of the same discourse. He didn't want the same kind of government as Hekmatyar. And so the answer was they were fighting a revolution that was born in response to the genuine outrage of the communist government, but which by the time you get to the 1990s, there is no communism anymore, right? There is no communism anymore. Anywhere, I mean, certainly there are communist parties and believers, but Soviet Union is gone, Cold War is over, communist governments have collapsed all over Europe. So Najibullah does what a lot of other communist strongmen did at that time, which he tried to turn himself into a nationalist, and he started preaching Islam and Afghan national identity. And so he tried to make it complicated for the rebels, basically saying, look, you know, and he was sort of the 1, 2, 3, 4th maybe communist president. So he wasn't around in some of the crazy early days. He was a secret police chief. He had a lot of blood on his hand, but anyway, he managed to kind of position himself as a moderate. And the reason we could see him as journalists, he would see us every time. If I was at the Washington Post, so he knew my audience included, you know, the government of the surviving superpower. So I could get an interview with him, and all he kept saying over and over again to anyone who would interview him was, look, you know, communism is the past. It's a messy world. Believe me, you don't want these radical Islamists to run Afghanistan. I mean, look at the trouble they're already causing. I mean, you know, look at the movements that they're funding in Egypt, and I have more in common with you than you think. You know, shake off your knee-jerk anti-communism and let's talk about what kind of a stable region we can create. That was kind of his message. And Gorbachev, the last president of the Soviet Union, you know, tried desperately to get the Americans to pay attention to this because it was his legacy too. He had withdrawn from Afghanistan. He didn't want to leave behind the very thing that his government had been fighting against, which was a radical country on its southern underbelly. But the Americans just, I mean, honestly, it wasn't, there were certainly people in the CIA or elsewhere who thought, he's a communist, the hell with it. Let's let the rebels have the country. Mm-hmm. But really at the higher levels of government, it wasn't as if they sat down and said, let's consider Mr. Gorbachev's proposition about how we can stabilize Afghanistan and consider, you know, alternatives. It may be hard work, but maybe we have an interest. Maybe he's right. No, those meetings just didn't happen, basically. Everybody was doing so many other things.
I feel like we get far down in the weeds and we can explain and talk through all these little scenarios of why things happen. But every so often, I feel like I have to step back and think it's been 40 years. And we're talking about Afghanistan. It's not a major economic partner of the United States. It's not a trade route. It's so confusing. There's so many different tribes and factions, and we're helping some people against the Soviets, and then some turn against us, but not all of them. So some of them we're helping again, and the ISI is in there. Why is it so complicated? Or are we just seeing more of these confusing, intertwined alliances in Afghanistan than elsewhere?
Well, I think, you know, historians would usually start by pointing out that Afghanistan has always been a buffer state between empires, right? So in the 19th century, it was the frontier between the British Empire in India and the Russian Empire, you know, of the czars, of the late czars. And its geography, especially in the 19th century when, you know, the pre-industrial transportation era, its geography meant people kind of had to slow down to get through Afghanistan because it's, you know, it's a jagged terrain. But it was also sort of by political agreement that the British were kind of satisfied with the western border of what is now Pakistan being their empire. And the Russians were kind of satisfied with the Central Asian states that they had started to colonize prior to the birth of the Soviet Union. So it was a buffer state. And so and there were nonetheless wars there. The British went in twice, 3 times, because they were trying to solve problems, kind of like what we were going in after 9/11. Oh, we got to go.
We're here to
solve
help.
the problem. Yeah, we're here to help. And so its geography as a buffer state and the interests around it was run. The other thing is that I think political scientists would say that weak states often draw in big powers when they have problems. Like when the weak states fall apart, other states go in to either grab resources or to try to stabilize things in their own interest or try to solve their own problems. Syria being a recent example. All right, so Syria falls apart and it draws in basically all the neighbors into the civil war that follows. That was very much the case in Afghanistan. Yes, the Soviets started the war by fomenting this coup and then invading to prop up these crazy guys who went too far. To replace them, basically, is why they invaded. They had bad communist partners. They wanted better communist partners, so they sent in 40,000 troops to put in a new government. Then they stimulated this huge revolt. But as the revolt became a civil war and the country just collapsed, I mean, its infrastructure collapsed. It was already a weak state, and now it becomes a highly unstable kind of feeding ground for regional powers. Every neighbor got involved, in some cases in the pursuit of their own security. I mean, Pakistan would say it got involved to basically try to extend its western frontier and protect itself from Afghanistan by influencing Afghanistan. Iran had its fingers in pre-revolution and post-revolution because it has natural ties, linguistic ties, cultural ties, and it has a big border with Afghanistan.
Sure.
So, and then, the Saudis got involved because of the ideology of transnational Islamism, and so on. So, yeah, it's a classic case of a buffer state. Now, just to finish this thought, one of the things that used to drive the Americans crazy in the post-2001 period in the ARG, in the palace where the Afghan president works and lives, was when Hamid Karzai, the president of Afghanistan between 2001 and 2009, he used to tell the Americans all the time, based on this discussion we've just been having, he used to say all the time, well, Afghanistan, is the most important country in the world. I mean, just look at the history of our geography. We're the buffer state between empires. You're here because everyone always comes here because we're the most important geography in the world. And the Americans would be like what you were saying before. What? Why are we here?
Yeah.
But and basically their message to him was, you are overestimating your importance to the world. Yes, we came here because of Al-Qaeda and 9/11, but we're not staying because we think we're playing the great game of the 19th century. No. And yet it's still a subject that Afghans and Pakistanis and others spend a lot of time arguing about, which is what is the right way to interpret the significance of this very poor and weak and troubled country that, you say 40 years, this is a very common American and international reaction to the truth about Afghanistan. It has been at war with itself for 40 years. Plus now 43. And the only thing that I like to add is we have to remember how this started. Afghanistan was at peace with itself and its neighbors between 1920, I mean, really, you can go back to the 19th century, but for many, many decades between 1920 and 1980, didn't trouble anybody, had a small army, multi-ethnic army, fairly stable, about 80,000 soldiers, didn't get into wars with anybody, didn't have a civil war, had a weak government. People used to drive, college students used to get out of college, get VW vans in Germany, drive them across Afghanistan, stop, smoke hashish, drive. You could drive all the way from Turkey through Iran, through Afghanistan, all the way to India. That was the old hippie trail. And everyone had all these fond memories of how wonderful it was to drive across southern Afghanistan in your van and camp out under the stars. I mean,
Sure.
so that's what
And
Afghanistan was.
I was going to say it would be, and at that time in particular, it would have still looked like the way Jesus walked, just
Yeah.
with vehicles, with
Yeah.
there,
Yeah.
and it still kind of is that way too. And then to think that you didn't have physical danger, it would be like stepping back in time
Yeah.
for sure.
But the reason that all ended was not because Afghanistan is innately inclined to civil war. It wasn't because Afghanistan turned on itself. It was because the Cold War polarized its elites, and then the Soviet Union invaded from the outside. This 40-year war was started by an outside invasion. It was not the product of Afghanistan's weakness as a state.
I'd like to get into one of those other outside powers. When I was there in 2012, we were training some Afghan officers, and it was during the Olympics. I don't know if that would have been summer or probably Summer Olympics. It was on the TV, and one of my counterparts leaned over to his Afghan counterpart and said, "Hey, if we keep doing well, maybe the Olympics will be in Afghanistan one day." And he said, "No, Pakistan would never allow it." And we all laughed awkwardly. But how much of a role does Pakistan play in all of this?
A huge, huge role, especially in this 40-year period that we're talking about. You know, it's funny, in that period we were just describing the kind of hippie bus trail. You know, Afghanistan was a place that people went shopping, and Pakistan was a place they went shopping from. You know, I mean, Afghanistan was, yeah, much more sort of integrated into the region. But look, Pakistan has been ruled by its military directly and indirectly since it became independent in 1947 at the end of the British Empire, right? So we all know the backstory. British left their Indian Empire in a hurry after the Second World War, and quickly drawing lines on a map, they created the Hindu majority state of India and the Muslim majority state of Pakistan. Pakistan to the west, at the time it had another eastern wing that became Bangladesh, but we won't detain ourselves with that. So the country that is today Pakistan was drawn between what is today India and what was always independent Afghanistan. It has a huge border, land border with Afghanistan, Pakistan does. Huge land border, which the people who live along that border have never really recognized. They go back and forth, they walk back and forth, they don't, you know, and the line on the map has never been agreed by the two governments, even going back to the British days. So now you're Pakistan. What is your view of the world? You're run by a military, you're run by generals who are basically trained in the British system. A lot of them go to Sandhurst. You know, they speak excellent English. They send their children to school in the UK and in the US. They're an elite. They run, you know, they participate in a lot of UN missions around the world. They've got a pretty sizable, you know, army. They buy a lot of US F-16s. They build a pretty good Air Force. They also have a Navy because they're facing the Arabian Sea. And what matters to them? What does this military government wake up every morning and go to sleep every night thinking about? India. Why? Because they end up fighting 3 wars with India between independence and 1971. They lose all 3. They lose half their country in the 71 war. And they see India as an existential threat. Their belief is that the Indian government of different eras doesn't think that Pakistan should exist, that this was a mistake the British made on their way out, and that ultimately India, at a minimum, is going to want to demilitarize Pakistan, weaken it, and maybe just kind of knock it out of existence. And they're in a rough position because India's got a huge population, a bigger industrial base, and they've had some good moments in their wars with India, but basically it's a difficult enemy to have because of the difference in scale. So that's what the military, that's the lens through which the military sees everything in Pakistan, and that's the lens through which it sees Afghanistan. So you can't understand Pakistan's activities in Afghanistan unless you start with the centrality of India. And for them, what they see in Afghanistan is Indian mischief, Indian danger, an Indian backdoor. India already has this huge border on Pakistan's eastern side. A lot of it's desert. The Indians put a bunch of tanks in the desert, and basically if a war starts, they're going to go crashing into Pakistan, cut the country in half. And this is the dismemberment scenario. And then on their western border, on the other side, is Afghanistan. So the Indians are building friendships with Kabul governments, and they're starting to build consulates along the Pakistan border. And they're basically, Pakistan sees Afghanistan as a vulnerability. They're the meat in the sandwich that India is creating around them. And what they want is to push their defense against India forward into Afghanistan by achieving political influence over Afghanistan. If they can control Afghanistan, they create what one of their chiefs of army staff once called strategic depth, meaning that if they get whacked by an Indian armor force coming from their east, they can kind of pull back into Afghanistan's terrain. They can maybe hide some of their aircraft there. They can regroup. They can fight a guerrilla war. You know, they can make it hard on the Indians. And so what they always saw an opportunity and a threat coming from Afghanistan in relation to India. So during the communist period, India was an ally of the Soviet Union. So when they saw the communist government in Kabul, they saw India, basically. And
Sure.
so that's why, and they were afraid that they would push into Pakistan. That was part of why they supported the rebels. After the Civil War started, after the Soviets left and the Civil War started, you know, then all of the mess of Afghanistan started spilling into Pakistan: drugs, guns, Kalashnikovs on the streets in Karachi, just like tons of problems, refugees.
Oh, yeah,
4 million
millions.
refugees, you know, millions. And they're like, so what they're trying to do, and this was true during the American period as well, after 2001, they basically are trying to push all of Afghanistan's problems and the threat of India as they see it, as they experience in Pakistan, just push it back into Afghanistan. Like, just get it over the hills.
Just like that.
You guys, like, why am I dealing with you on the streets of my cities? Like, you take all of your civil war, your drugs, your guns, like, we're going to control our country, you go over there. And also to try to undermine India's influence in Afghanistan. And to do this, they've chosen one radical Islamist ally after another. Pakistan has become more influenced by Islamist ideology as the years have gone by. It started out, I think, more cynically. You had these very secular whiskey sipping generals, you know, with British accents, taking the mullahs and using them as a way to get after the atheist communists. So kind of cynical and instrumental. But now I think, you know, a lot more kind of common view of the world, both nationalist and Islamist. But their two big proxy forces have been first Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who we've talked enough about, and the Taliban, who came after. The Taliban became their way to kind of clean up Afghanistan, to end the civil war, and to control Afghan territory. And if the Taliban scared the world because of their radical ideas, who did they scare most of all? India. Good. Let them be scared. You know, let them be off balance. And it's sort of, you know, I think international relations people would say it's a classic case of a sort of small to medium-sized power in a deep rivalry with a much larger power, and seizing on asymmetric defenses, the kinds of things that small people can do to keep big guys off balance. In the case of Pakistan, their asymmetric defenses are terrorism, nuclear weapons, and a kind of crazy look in their eyes. We could do anything.
Sure.
You know, a friend of mine once said that the Pakistanis are the world's best negotiators at negotiating with a gun pointed at their own heads. Because one of the things they all often say is, like, if you push us too hard, we're just going to fall apart and our nukes are going to get loose and the whole world's going to get blown up.
I was picturing a guy with pulling the grenade and pulling the pin on it.
Yeah.
I'll let go. I swear I will. Don't make me do it. But think about it. Like, we freak out about China, of course. and we're like so far away. It's sort of imaginary in a sense. It's hard to really fathom where China is when I'm sitting in Ohio right now, especially their size. And we're the third largest country in the world still. And then you got Pakistan. That's like, I just looked it up. It's like 245 million, butted right up against what they're calling this really long historic rival enemy, whatever you want to put a label on, India. It's 1.4 billion almost, and they share a border. So just to put it in perspective here, I think it's very hard for us to sort of fathom that, not even animosity, but tension, when we're already feeling, and we feel it against Russia, and we're lucky to be all the way over here. They don't have that. So it'd definitely be a conundrum where there's definitely no right answers here.
Yeah. And, India has, and of course, Pakistan is a country founded on Muslim identity. It was also a moderate secular country at its founding. Its first president was a lawyer and a secular man, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And gradually it has become less, less moderate in that respect. But all along, they have faced the question of what does it mean to be a Muslim country when your enemy next door, India, has a population of, let's say, 1.4 billion, and it has a Muslim minority inside India that's almost the size of Pakistan's population, if not more.
Sure.
And so, in the early era of Indian politics, the Muslim minority was treated as a kind of national, kind of protected class. And, the whole philosophy was we're secular, we're diverse, we have many languages, we have many faiths. That's our identity in the world. We're the big melting pot. With America, we're like America. Everybody can find a place here. Well, in the last 20 years, Indian politics has been transformed by the rise of Hindu identity politics and Hindu nationalism. Now you have a government in India that is openly hostile to its own Muslim minority and has the kind of ardent, uncompromising attitude toward Pakistan that Pakistan always feared, and so in some ways it's become a self-fulfilling conflict. The radicals on both sides have been able to point to the radicals on the other side and say, see, yeah, I would have told you, like, Pakistan is a terrorist sponsoring state. So Hindus need to really take care of themselves, and none of these Muslims who live among us can be trusted. And then the Pakistanis point to India and say, see, we told you that they want to wipe us off the face of the earth. We're not, we're not paranoid. We're just realistic. And so this enmity, which, 10, 15 years ago, it looked like maybe a younger technocratic generation, tech entrepreneurs, artists, cultural figures, Bollywood stars, Pakistani movie stars, that somehow this next generation would kind of take the edge off things. Not happening. The conflict is still there, and it still affects Afghanistan because Pakistan still sees its security against India located in its political influence in Afghanistan through the Taliban today.
Holy cow, it's complicated. Your latest book, if I'm not mistaken, Steve, is Directorate S, the C.I.A. and America's Secret Wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan, 2018. Anything else in the works coming up?
Yeah, I'm finishing, I'm going to do a third book about Afghanistan after Ghost Wars and Directorate S. Directorate S ended around 2016, took the American experience through the drawdown, but there was this, 15,000 NATO troops or American troops plus NATO there, circa 2014, 15, 16. And I ended the book because I just ran out of time, and I wasn't going to do another one. Then after the events of last August, I decided I would do a third volume about the fall of the Islamic Republic and the end of the American involvement. So I'm starting to work on that, but I have another one that I've just almost finished writing. It's about a different subject. It's about the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, the US invasion of Iraq but from Saddam's point of view, Saddam Hussein's point of view. It turns out there's a ton of materials from his office. He tape recorded his leadership conversations more often than Richard Nixon. So there's
Really?
a huge resource of what he was thinking and saying throughout this
Wow.
history, very complicated history with the United States. And, you know, in our country, we've kind of absorbed the bad intelligence about WMD and the debates over why we went to war and was it necessary and who made the mistakes and why was there no WMD. A lot of that's been sorted through and documented, but you can ask the question in another way, which is why did Saddam lose his life, ultimately, his son's lives, his government, for weapons he didn't possess? Like, how did that happen? And so the book takes a very broad view of that question and goes back to when he came to power and the Americans kind of started a secret CIA liaison with him during the 80s to help him avoid losing the war with Iran that he had started, and how confused both sides ended up about one another all the way up until the invasion.
You've got me excited for that one because my goodness,
Yeah.
what type of context it, because you're right. It's not black and white. Were there WMDs? Yes or no? And was that the right decision? Yes or no? I mean, gee whiz.
Yeah.
So especially when we're still within living memory of the events too, to sort of encapsulate that with whatever information we have for today. I'm going to read it for sure.
Steve, thank you so much for taking the time. Looking forward to those two. And yeah, really appreciate the conversation.
All right, appreciate it. Good luck, you guys.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, Steve.